Ayabonga Cawe, of course, you know him very, very well, still with me here. All right, Ayabonga, we've spoken about tax, we've spoken about SAA. I was a little intrigued by the extra 2.4 million rand that goes to the justice agencies. I mean, Malungelo was just talking to Ronald Lamola there. It's a little bit of a nod in a way to the Zondo Commission, I wondered. So, more money to the NPA, more money to the Hawks.
I think there is an acceptance across the government that there's a need to not only modernize but also bring our courts closer to the people. You'd recall, Steve, a few weeks ago we had the offices of the Master of the High Court closed. And so it really speaks volumes about trying now to lend the resources to the task of really transforming our judicial system and making it more accessible to people, but also, I guess, more up to the task of trying to follow up on some of the things that have happened over the last few years or so. And one of those, of course, Stephen, is the Zondo Commission, which has asked for its own extension. And we certainly hope that a lot of what comes out of there might also lead to a recovery of some funds, because many of the entities that we've been supporting from a sort of extra budgetary perspective outside of the main general budget, a lot of what has happened there is state capture that really now needs to be recouped by way of resources from some of the culprits that are involved. And the real pity that I think many people are calling for is that we haven't seen anybody in orange overalls on the back of what has happened at many of our SOEs.
Okay, I asked this question of David Masondo, and he gave quite a long answer, and it is a difficult question. The question was, everyone's been saying this has been the toughest budget in at least 10 years, probably longer. Based on what we've seen today, next year's budget, and that budget process actually starts probably tomorrow,
yes.
Is next year's budget going to be harder or easier? And there's obviously a lot of ground there. The talks in the public sector, there's what happens at SAA, one big strike could change everything. We could find that actually there is already some sort of agreement, there's been a change in the dynamics somehow. If Eskom continues to sort of make small progress, but consistent progress, all of that could change. Is it even possible to say next year if Tito Mboweni is going to find it a tougher night beforehand than it was last night?
I don't know, Stephen, if I'm a Sangoma, but I can tell you right now that there are 2 or 3 things in my view that I think are going to influence whether or not next year becomes a tougher budget for the Treasury than what was presented earlier on today. I think the first one has to do with the SOEs. If indeed there's an expectation of some special appropriation or allocation to some of the SOEs, it might be Donnell, it might be Eskom, it might be SAA, we might find ourselves in the same squeeze. I think the second piece is really around growth. You've seen in some of the numbers that came out around tax buoyancy, which measures how responsive tax revenues are to growth. And we're already seeing a very strong relationship between the two, that if we grow our economy, we're more likely to get tax revenues coming in. The forecasts that have come in for growth have come in a lot lower than what was forecast sometime last year. And if indeed those forecasts become a lot more worse, there might be a much more difficult task to try and scrounge around and find a bit more revenue. Maybe the third thing is really around, I guess, in particular the reorganization of Eskom. What does it mean to have one transmission company, a generation company, and a distribution company, all with your own management teams, all with your own boards? What will that mean for the reliance that Eskom has on the fiscal end of things? And if we don't sort out what's happening on Eskom's income statement, from a revenue and even a headcount perspective when it comes to the expenses, we might find ourselves in a much tougher situation next year.
And so variables range from what happens at Megawatt Park to what happens with Soweto at payment rates there, and whether Meadowlands continues and Rocklands and Rockville continue with the protests that they've been having. Right, so a lot of variables to come. The real story is probably for the next 2 weeks going to be about the unions. because COSATU is going to issue statements, PSA is going to issue statements. It's probably going to be a little while before we know where we are, because in the past, in my experience anyway, these negotiations don't always happen in the open, and they can't because their constituencies are watching.
Something interesting has happened here, Stephen. You'd recall that the 250 billion rand proposal that COSATU had put down, the mechanism there was about taking future earnings of working people and putting them in to save Eskom, with the concession that there would be no retrenchments. What has been presented here today is taking money from all of us in the fiscus to try and save Eskom, and then potentially using also the public sector wages and a cut on that to really finance Eskom. Now, I think many working people in this country would be viewing it from that perspective, that potentially our jobs are on the line, potentially any pay progression or any improvement in our incomes is also on the line on the basis of the government having to support Eskom. And the big question that COSATU will be asking themselves is, what then happens to our proposal? If you're going out now and saying you want to cut the public sector wage bill by 160 billion rand and still give special appropriation allocations to Eskom, what does that then mean about the future of our proposal, and by extension the future employment of many of our members. I think that's the main conundrum that is going to emerge from this. I think it also plays itself into the politics of the governing coalition. Because if you think about it, within the alliance, the National General Council in the next few months or so, and I can tell you right now, there would be intense debates around this particular issue and what this is going to mean. And maybe later on in the year, after Treasury now has withdrawn their commitment to the third year of the multi-year agreements, we might also find ourselves in another wave of public sector wage negotiations. So a lot set to happen.
Fascinating analysis. Ayabonga Cawe, thank you very much indeed. We have to leave it there for the moment, I'm afraid. Plenty more reaction, plenty more news, plenty more developments from the budget 2020 coming here at Newzroom Africa. Stay with us.